Hi, this is Eric Knapp, VP of Technology Marketing for NitroSecurity, demonstrating why NitroView Enterprise Security Manager, the industry's fastest and most scalable SIEM, is uniquely capable of monitoring, assessing, and mitigating risks and threats. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about risks and how to discover and manage them. Risk management begins with the inherent risks within our networks and requires an understanding of the users, systems, and services used in those networks. This means understanding vulnerability and utilizing the tools that are available to us to minimize inherent risk. Vulnerabilities should be patched, and point security devices like firewalls and intrusion detection systems should be configured to mitigate whatever inherent risk remains. NitroView makes this easy by not only providing the means to assess risk and vulnerability, but by monitoring configurations and changes, and for users of the NitroGuard IPS, actively managing firewall and IPS policies as well. The real risks present go beyond the inherent risks of vulnerabilities and misconfigurations, however. To assess the actual risk, you need to look for indications of malicious activity from external and internal sources. This starts with anomaly detection and goes all the way to advanced multi-source correlation. Looking at risk on a scale of severity, the presence of a vulnerability or misconfiguration is only a starting point. The first indication that a vulnerability has been exploited is typically a variation of normal activity, that is, an anomaly. While network anomaly detection is often a focal point for risk prediction, NitroView takes a more holistic approach, looking for anomalous behavior in user behavior, application usage, event activity, and other information in addition to just network activity. Once an event occurs, however, the risk assessment process remains open. One isolated event does imply risk, but the true risk involved with any event can't be determined without first understanding where the attack came from, what the target was, who was involved, and if data was accessed, what that data was and what implications of its loss might be. Understanding this means understanding context, network, user, application, and other context, and utilizing that with an advanced correlation engine to detect the patterns that mean real risk. Logging into NitroView ESM, the first thing that I notice is that there is a new case that's been assigned to me, telling me that unauthorized traffic has been seen by the firewall. Now, you can't talk about risks without talking about threats, and this is a threat. So I'll drill into this case, and we see that there's been a notification that outbound traffic was blocked by the PIX firewall. This is the event that was associated with this case, and if I look at the details of that, I see that, yes indeed, it did come from our NitroView receiver. The original data source was a Cisco PIX2. We see the source destination IP, MAC port, etc. We do see that it was the TCP protocol running on port 25, which is SMTP, or email. There's additional information we can see, including geolocation, a description of that event, the original packet of that event, and if the event was stored for compliance reasons, can actually pull the raw log, which has been signed and stored for non-repudiation. Now, I could look at this event singularly, or, because I know it was sourced from an enclave that was secure, I can look specifically at that secure enclave. I happen to know that the IP range for that is the 69.20 Class B CIDR block. However, to make things easier, because not everybody knows the subnet ranges of their devices, we have a dynamically created asset group called Enclave, which accomplishes the same thing. Now if I apply that filter and look at the dashboard, we see that now we've focused the events down only to items sourced from the 69.20 network range. And I can immediately see when I look at the events listed here by severity that one of them in particular draws my attention because it's a malware event followed by port 25 activity. Now port 25 activity is what triggered the initial alert, which resulted in someone assigning me this case. So we'll ignore the rest for now and we'll focus just on this event. Now by selecting that event, everything else on my dashboard updated to reflect just that information, and I can see that there are two correlated events. This particular one An IP packet destined by the access list was denied. That's the original source event that was used to assign that case. We can see it was also a Trojan downloader was possible, and together these two source events rolled up to the possible spam bot event. Now, an interesting point here is that I can see the specific source events in their entirety and the details associated with those source events. So while I can see the details associated with the correlated event, in some cases you need to dive deeper to see what happened originally. Now, if I look at this other high severity event, I see the same source IP, also IP packets being access denied to the firewall, and I see this push to check-in. Now, that is a suspected callback over TCP port 80, which is HTTP or web traffic. Again, risks and threats are tied closely together. So what we will want to do, while the legitimate corporate firewall policy allows HTTP port 80 traffic, is we want to blacklist this user, not the source user. That source user has probably legitimate reasons to go to the web. However, we can blacklist the destination, which is the recipient of that malware check-in. And by doing this, we've adjusted the strength of our security perimeter to reduce risk activity. Not much is real. Now, I want to take a step back quickly to talk about how we came up with this dynamic enclave asset group. Understanding the context of your assets directly impacts your risk profile. Just as with a secure enclave where you know certain things should be talking to other things, the more you know about the assets being used in your network and how they should behave allows you to do exception reporting that can identify risk. And the way we do that is by taking the information from vulnerability assessment scans from products such as Nessus, Qualys, Rapid7, EI, Lamention, Saint, Foundstone, etc. And we take the asset information, the result of those scans, and use them to create dynamic asset filter groups. For example, in the case of my enclave, I know quite simply that it's a subnet. But more relevant is when we have examples such as Windows HTTP, and I take everything that is a Windows operating system that I see running HTTP protocols, and NitroView dynamically creates a filter group containing all of the assets that are Windows machines and running HTTP. Now there's 10 assets discovered here. If there is a subsequent vulnerability scan that identifies additional systems, they'll be added as the 11th, 12th assets, etc. And again, these filter groups can be used anywhere within the system now. Where I was using my enclave before, I now have a new one which is called Windows HTTP 2. Now in this case, we already had a correlation rule in place to help detect this spam bot. And we can look at that rule and when we do, we see that it's a combination of normalized event activity indicating malware behavior, as well as normalized event activity that involves miscellaneous authentications, destination ports of 25 combined with a source IP that's not a known SMTP server, or a destination IP that is in an external network. So that's a very specific correlation rule designed to detect spam bots, which luckily in this case was in place already. Now what if we didn't have that? We simply create a new rule. And based on the observed activity, we now have the capability to detect future instances of those threats, putting us at risk. Now, using the example of our enclave, we can simply say that if we see activity which is in our secure enclave, and again I have that dynamic asset group which defines that, we'll add some logic to that and say, and we know that the destination IP address is not in that enclave. Now we have a much broader correlation rule that will indicate any traffic from a secure enclave that's communicating outside of the enclave. This will provide notification at a much higher level before a threat has occurred. Now we may want to add additional logic to that. We may want to say, for example, anything sourced from within the enclave where the destination IP is outside the enclave, or perhaps it's legitimate traffic within its secure realm, but we've seen some sort of a threat activity which has a high severity. Now, in the case of our correlated spam bot rule, we saw that the severity was 60, so I'll say anything 60 or higher, I want to be notified of that as well. And we now have a correlation rule, which I will call threat to enclave. So now we've seen how we can detect threats, how we can dynamically strengthen the perimeter defenses using blacklist capabilities built within ESM. And all of this helps to reduce the risk that your network is exposed to. However, once all this configuration work has been put in place, you also need to make sure that those configurations themselves don't change. And the way we do that is using the configuration management tools built into NitroView ESM. Once configured, devices can be pulled for configuration analysis daily, weekly, hourly, monthly, at hour-minute increments, or whatever suits you. And configuration files are stored within a history. Now you can check the configuration to make sure it's running against the approved value at any given time, manually as well. You can view the current configuration file. And if there are two configuration files you wish to compare, there's a compare tool as well, allowing you to quickly assess the configuration files that are in place, whether they're accurate, whether if there was a change made, it was a legitimate change or not, and then allowing you to approve that to implement a new approved configuration profile.
Risks and threats are tied closely together. So now let's examine some common threat activity. According to the most recent supplement to the 2009 Verizon Data Breach Report, the majority of threats still occur in the form of malware or a direct hack, and often combinations thereof. These threats could occur from either inside or outside of the company, but it's very clear that the detection of these threats requires looking for indicators from both. Monitoring configurations to ensure the integrity and validity of ACLs, for example, is an important mitigating step for some of these threats, and is recommended using either integrated change management functions such as those within NitroView, or via a dedicated configuration management tool. However, across all of the threats associated with the most risk, those that occur most frequently and with the most associated data loss, detection requires monitoring of user behavior, event activity from point security devices, such as IPSs, web content filters, firewalls, etc., monitoring of inbound and outbound traffic for anomalous communication channels or payloads, and monitoring of application data for policy violations such as weak passwords or protocol anomalies that might indicate a covert communication or control channel. User behavior is a common indicator across most threats, and monitoring of user activity is especially important when concerning administrative users, and authentication against databases and applications that contain sensitive information. This requires not only dedicated monitoring of network activity, user activity, database activity, and applications, it also requires a SIM capable of collecting, normalizing, correlating, and analyzing that degree of information to a usable scale.
Now, I've talked a lot about anomaly detection, so let's look at how NitroView can detect anomalies. I'll start with my normalized event dashboard, which personally is one of my favorites. The first thing that you'll notice is that the bars have a color differentiation. Now, this is representing the standard deviation above or below dynamically calculated baseline behavior. This is essentially an at-a-glance trend analysis of all collected information. In this case, we're looking at events, and we're looking at those events grouped by our normalization taxonomy. We're also looking at the source and destination IPs associated with those events. Now, I can quickly see a abnormally high behavior by looking at the red bars. In this case, we see a change in value that's almost 44% above expected behavior for any event that's normalized as an authentication event. Now, because NitroView ESM allows you to dynamically link data together, when I select, say, suspicious activity, the rest of the dashboard will update in real time to focus specifically on events that are normalized as a suspicious activity. Now, not only has the information updated relevant only now to suspicious activity, but these baselines have been recalculated as well, because the context with which we're looking at this information has changed. This allows me to very quickly see that of that suspicious activity, the majority of it is suspicious protocol use, which is much higher than expected. It also allows us to see that there are two particular event types. In this case, we have TCP data using non-established connections with the fin flags that are in a non-established state. So this is TCP protocol behavior primarily that's causing this anomalous behavior. And we can see that these 4 source IP addresses show extreme amounts of this activity as well as being extremely above normal behavior. This could be a clear indicator that these 4 machines have been compromised by some sort of malware, for example. So I can immediately drill in, I can look at event information, I can summarize that information on a variety of parameters, I can look at the network information, application, topology, geolocation, flow analysis, asset analysis, etc. of these 4 IP addresses to further investigate why this anomalous behavior might be occurring. Now, many systems focus on network flow analysis, and what we've seen here is event anomalies and flow anomalies being analyzed together, but we may want to look at anomalies from other contexts. And to demonstrate this, I'll create a new view. And I'm going to create a very quick view that shows us application use. We'll look at, let's see, commands used by those applications. And let's see, source users. Now, like any component within any dashboard within NitroView, all I need to do is select that component and enable baselines. Now you'll see that there's an automatic time range used for the dynamic baseline calculation, which is set to a 5 times increment over whatever period of time I'm analyzing at the moment. I currently have this set to current day. It will dynamically calculate the baselines based on a 5-day period of observed behavior. And if I refresh the screen, we'll see those calculated baselines. Now if I change the context by looking at, say, a 48-hour period, we're now dynamically calculating these baselines again, looking at a history of 5 48-hour periods, and you'll see that the baseline indicators have changed. Now another interesting thing to look at is when you are looking at severity. I'll just do a quick bar chart here to represent all events by total severity. And I'll make this one a little bigger so it's easier to see. And in this case, we see that there are already color indicators, in this case, severity indicators, red being most severe, green being least severe. Now if I enable baseline capabilities in this case, rather than confuse the user by adding red indicators to non-severe events, the red-blue indication is foregone, but the baseline indicators are still available. So looking at IP packets that have been denied by the access list, I see that there is a moderate increase in activity. Now in some cases there is no baseline capability because the event has not been observed long enough. So we're looking at 48-hour periods. If I come back and look again at 24 hours, it will calculate again and you'll see that there's a greater indication of baseline activity within this event list. Very powerful feature. What I want to do for a moment is talk about how this anomaly detection capability can really affect your risk profile. How do we use this to reduce risk? Well, we do that through a notification system. If we see that threat activity has or is occurring, we can use that information to strengthen our defenses, and by strengthening our defenses, we reduce risk. Now, using NitroView's dynamic baselining capabilities to trigger notification, we can detect rising risk and threat activity and act upon it. We can do that from something that's very broad or something that's very focused. Now, first thing that I'll do is I'll look for, we saw authentication activity being fairly severe. So I want to be notified if that occurs. So I'm going to set a condition that says if I see a deviation that is plus or minus 10%, it's a condition type of a deviation from a baseline, and I set that to 10% above or 10% below. Choose that condition. Now I want to apply a filter. And that filter is going to say, if I see normalized events that are authentication events, maybe I want to narrow that down and say it's password events, not just any authentication, but password related authentication events. I now have a new notification that will set up anomaly notification password events. I can then log that. I can send it as an email, SNMP, or syslog. I can choose the specific devices within the system tree that I want to focus on when doing those events, and I can choose, for example, who I want to receive that email. In this case, it would be me. And now, every time that a notification occurs, I'll get an email saying there has been a 10% deviation from expected baseline activity for authentication password events. Now let's look at another example. This time a very specific example. We have our spam bot. In the previous demonstration we saw that there was direct evidence that there was spam bot activity, and we took some action to stop that by implementing a dynamic blacklist to our intrusion prevention system that would stop outbound communication to that spam bot's call home. But what if it recurs? So they found a way to obfuscate our defenses and the spam bot is continuing to operate. Well, again, we'll do some conditions. In this case, it may not be, I may want a deviation that is much smaller, say plus or minus 1%, or I may just want to say once. In this case, for the sake of example, I'll say we have a specified event rate of 1 event. If any event occurs for this rule, I will be notified. Now, this is a non-tried, non-tuned rule, so I'll say that I'm going to set the maximum condition trigger frequency to an hour. So if this triggers 1,000 events, I won't get 1,000 notifications. I will now select that condition. And in this case, I'm going to add a couple of filters. First is that the source IP is the source IP of the machine that was suspected of hosting a spam bot. Which again, that IP address is available in the case that was created to track that specific event, which we looked at in the previous demo. Now at a very high level within our normalization taxonomy, I want to say if there are any suspicious activities or any indication of malware from that source IP, I want that to trigger the notification as well. Again, I can set that to email me as a PDF when that occurs. So what we've done now is very easily, we've used observed threat activity along with anomaly detection to predict new threats and react to existing threats so that we can proactively reduce risk.
Now we've talked a little bit about risks and threats, and we'll talk a little bit more about how patterns of threat activity can be indicators of advanced risks in a moment. But first I'd like to talk about the stages of risk in terms of mitigation and what that means to a SIM. The first stage, inherent risk, requires a strong defensive posture in terms of applying patches, blocking vulnerabilities, and ensuring that anti-malware resources are current. Next comes traditional event management, based upon indications provided by an anomaly detection system. When an event does occur, we must then look for added context and for event patterns that indicate larger threats. And finally, we need to replace analysis with action, remediating the threat, and then thoroughly investigating that event to determine if there was a loss associated with it. Now, this methodology maps directly to the SIM. In the first stage, NitroView addresses configuration and change management directly within the SIM, as well as providing centralized policy management and integrated support for all major vulnerability assessment tools. NitroView also integrates with NitroGuard IPS, a combination IPS and firewall that can be used to protect against known vulnerabilities for when patches aren't available or practical. We've touched already on NitroView's anomaly detection capabilities. In addition to the NitroGuard IPS, which can again detect network anomalies and block them actively, NitroView is able to track the statistical characteristics of all collected data, including network activity, user activity, expected event behavior, application activity, and any other expected behavior of any other collected information source within the SIM. This provides a more comprehensive anomaly detection capability that looks across a wider array of systems and services. When an anomaly does occur, you are immediately notified and able to use NitroView's real-time investigative capability to hopefully stop that threat from ever occurring. But when an event does occur, NitroView offers a more advanced event management and correlation capability as well. All of the same context that we've discussed, network, database, application, event, user, and other activities, are correlated together along with even more context from vulnerability, identity, authentication, network location, and even privacy systems. Both automatic detection, correlation, and manual event investigations are done in real time to again help protect against the isolated event from progressing to true risk. In the final stage, once a larger threat incident has occurred and has been detected, the same response is possible to remediate quickly, including quarantining offending users or devices, or pushing blacklists to the perimeter IPS and firewall. At this point, everything has been logged for compliance as well. However, because NitroView can see into database and application activity, those logs will go further, providing a real indication of loss, so that if the breach ultimately failed to retrieve protected data, you'll have auditable proof that will protect you from damaging public loss disclosures. Now, because the last two stages of risk can be confusing, let's step back and take a closer look. Events aren't necessarily just events, and a correlated event on its own doesn't necessarily mean a threat or a risk. In the presence of malware, on its own, isn't uncommon, and malware events will likely appear frequently within your SIM. Not even considering vulnerability assessment, let's look one step further, where we see new, more complex events that occur as a result of malware that is introduced along with other variables. These new correlated events are more meaningful and represent greater risk. However, even they might simply be the building blocks of something much larger. For example, malware events, when combined with other indicators, can mean greater threats with a more moderate impact. Here we see at the top left a malware event combined with web traffic coming from a non-web server. That itself is the indication that there might be a possible bot or perhaps a covert channel sending communications outside of your network. At the bottom left, we see a malware event combined with email traffic that was detected on the firewall from a device that shouldn't be sending email. Those two combined could indicate a spam bot. But when we take those two possibilities and we combine them together, we come to the certain conclusion that there is a covert HTML-based spam bot which has significant impact and represents significant risk.
As we move from the predictive aspects of risk management concerned with vulnerability assessment and anomaly detection, and we move more towards the reactive nature of threat management and incident response, we need to talk about event correlation. Event correlation takes all event and flow data, all the information collected by the SIEM, and looks for specific patterns of activity that might indicate a larger threat. In this case, during the current day, we're seeing almost 3 million events, and that's being boiled down to a little under 2,000 correlated events. These correlated events represent more serious threat activity. We see examples here, very, very simple correlated events, such as multiple events from a single host, to more severe correlated events, such as a reconnaissance followed by an exploit, to our possible spam bot, all the way up to possible HTTP command and controls. Now, if we go back to our original case, you'll see that the case initiated with a specific single event. We were seeing an instance of email traffic being blocked by a corporate firewall that was not expected behavior. Now, we investigated that and we discovered our possible spam bot. And when we did that, we added a blacklist to block the malware call home. We then set up further notifications to alert of any anomalous behavior that might indicate the recurrence of the spam bot from that same host. Now let's take it a step further. And I'll go back to that specific event. I'll filter on the source IP of our original spam bot event. And we'll actually see that there's 2 correlated events associated with this user. Now again, almost 800 total events from one user in one day, but there are only 2 incidents from that which we really need to be concerned about. If we look at the original spam bot event, we can see, and I'll zoom this in so we can see it a little bit better, this event, which is our detected malware combined with unauthorized port 25 activity, which can indicate a possible spam bot, is comprised of the following source events. So we see in this case, our access deny on the firewall combined with our malware check-in, and we can get the details of these individual events as well to investigate them and take action on them as we did. Let's go back and now look at this HTTP command and control spam bot. The first thing that we'll see is that the source events making up the HTTP command and control include the first correlation event. So this is actually a 2-stage correlation event where we saw possible spam bot behavior combined with a third condition, which in this case is we see a non-HTTP server acting as an HTTP server. If we look into this a little more, again, I'll expand this so it's easier to see, we can go into the advanced details of this specific third condition. We can actually look at the session involved, and we can see in this case that there is an executable embedded within that HTTP stream. armor2.net.exe. Doesn't sound very good, does it? So combined, we have now not just an instance of a possible spam bot, but something much more severe. And when you look at these, you'll see that they are indeed ordered by severity. Now there's only 2 events here with 1 instance of each event, but if we look at the spam bot, we see a total severity of 67. When we look at our command and control, we see a total severity of 90. Now again, we're looking at just 2 events, so the benefits of that may not be immediately clear, but if we jump back to look at all events, you'll notice that the command and control remains at the top. It is the highest severity event in our entire network for the current day. Now this is very important when we talk about incident response. So we've detected an event, we've been notified of it, either visually through the user interface or through the notification system of NitroView. Now what do? Well, there are a few things we can do. We can take a very active approach. Again, if I filter on our source user, when we first detected the spam bot, we decided it would be prudent to blacklist the destination, such that the device expecting to receive a call home would not receive that call home. But now that we know that there's command and control behavior in place, it may be time to blacklist the source. Now this will prevent our internal user from communicating past our perimeter defenses outbound in any way, shape, or form. Now if this is your network and you have the appropriate SNMP privileges on your switches and routers, which unfortunately I do not in this case, you can take further actions, including disabling the port that that device is attached to and or altering the VLAN of that port such that you can quarantine their traffic. Again, these are active reactions to mitigate any sort of risk from that threat activity. However, there are some more passive approaches we can take as well. That primarily involves further adjusting our detection and our notification capability. If we look at our original HTTP command and control rule, we can either expand the parameters, which will broaden the detection capability, but it will also increase the percentage of false positives, or we can focus the parameters, which will greatly reduce the number of false positives, but can also increase the number of false negatives. In reality, we need both. Broad detection builds a granular base of event data, which we've already shown can lead you to detect things going on in your network which you did not expect. Now, focusing the detection pinpoints threats, but since attacks evolve and you don't know what to expect, you can't rely on them. So by adjusting our detection capability, we can do a few things. Now, right now, we have a total severity of 100. This is an extremely important event. But we can modify this event. We can broaden the detection capability simply by saying, instead of looking for this pattern of a possible spam bot and unexpected HTTP traffic over 10 minutes, we want to widen this. We want to say, if I see this over the course of 24 hours, for example. Now, what this will do is dramatically increase the instances within which this correlation rule will trigger. Now, as a result, as I mentioned, the chance of false positives increases as well. So what I may want to do is deduct severity from this newly modified event such that it's not going to bubble up to the top of the incidents which I as a security analyst need to manage day to day. Now at the same time, I could add additional conditions. Now for example, I'm involved in a very specific case where I know the source IP address, I know some other parameters around this attack, and I suspect that this threat is still occurring. So I can add conditions such as knowing that my source IP address was targeted from a secure enclave within my network, I can just very quickly say, if I have this possible command and control spam bot behavior and it involves any device sourced from my enclave, I want that severity to be the original 100. Now in this case, I would also set up, as I did before, a notification such that if that did occur and I weren't looking at the user interface and didn't see that that boiled up to the very top of my incident severity dashboard, that I would still be notified that this extremely dangerous threat behavior occurred.
Once an incident does occur, incident response is the next step. What's often overlooked when evaluating a SIM, however, is that response does not equal reporting. Incident response requires the lowest possible mean time to remediate. That means a SIM with the architectural capability of providing actionable intelligence within seconds, not the hours or even days that can often be required when looking at large amounts of data over long periods of time with legacy SIMs. NitroView provides this capability and also scales to billions of events and flows. NitroView's content awareness also provides visibility all the way up to layer 7, all the way into the specific application contents, ultimately providing an adaptive, dynamic, and responsive system.
Now I'd like to talk a little bit about NitroView in terms of performance. There are two main ways to talk about performance: getting information into your security information and event management system and getting it back out. Getting information in is relatively easy. NitroView, for example, supports hundreds of thousands of events per second from a variety of data sources. In our demo environment, you see that we have information coming from mainframes, from Linux and Windows servers. We have Cisco switches, routers, and firewalls, McAfee EPO devices, Fair Warning's healthcare privacy system, and a variety of other information sources. If we go to add a new data source, you can quickly see that most of the main security vendors are supported. Hundreds of total devices. There's a full list available at NitroSecurity.com. Now, as I mentioned, getting information into a SIM is relatively easy, which is important because the value of a SIM increases with the amount of information that it's able to analyze. The more visibility you have, the more capability you have to look into the dark corners of your network to find the threats and risks that might otherwise go undetected. But getting information out is the hard part. Where most security information and event management systems will attempt to maintain performance by reducing the granularity of collected data, limiting the data that's available for query or analysis over long periods of time, and archiving older data in order to limit the total amount of events being managed within the system at any given time, NitroView is able to collect large amounts of diverse information over very long periods of time and provide all of that information for analysis. Now we're looking at a system here that has approximately 4 billion total events and flows, collected over approximately 9 months. If we look at the system parameters, it is using only 1.3 terabytes of the included 6.4 terabytes of usable storage, approximately 21%. What this means is that in this environment, we could continue to collect and manage event and flow data for a period of several more years. But what do we do with all that data? Well, let's start by looking at a very, very finite amount of information. And we'll go to a view that shows us event activity over time. Now we can see here that with just the last minutes of information, we only have 18 events, and we can see expected behavior over time. But a minute isn't particularly useful for us in this example, so let's expand this to the current day's activity. Well, now we're looking at events, how they occurred over time, and expected behavior based upon our dynamic baseline calculations. And we're looking at a little over 2 million events. We're seeing all of the source and destination IPs of those events, and we're seeing a complete list of all of those events and the counts of those events. And we can see that in this case, the majority of this traffic is LimeWire traffic. But let's go back even further. Let's look at a previous months of information. Now, we often hear from customers and prospects that with legacy security information management systems, to run a report on a month's worth of information with fewer parameters than what we're looking at here could take a matter of hours. And we're able to retrieve this information again in just seconds, including a full baseline calculation of observed versus expected behavior. Let's take this a step even further, and let's look at the current year. Again, this information comes back in just a few seconds. We're now looking at over 1 billion events. We can see the source IPs, the destination IPs, and all of the events that have occurred over the entire year. Let's look at all event data collected over all time. Now again, in this demo environment, that's approximately 9 months of collected security information. Now if we look at this, we can see where all of these events have occurred over time. And in this case, each one of these vertical bars represents 4 days of information. Now the performance of the SIM not only lets you look at large amounts of data relatively quickly, but it lets you interact with that data quickly. So let's say we want to see what this particular spike of information is about. We simply drill in, and now we see, again with dynamically calculated baseline activity, the event data as it occurred over this period of time, which we're looking at November 8th through November 13th, with each of these vertical bars now representing 2 hours. We can continue to drill in, and drill in more, and even more. Now we're looking at vertical bars that represent a second in time. I've gone from 9 months of information to a particular second in just a few seconds itself. Now if I select a 1 second period of time, you'll notice that the rest of the dashboard updates, showing me the events, source IPs and destination IPs of only the activity that occurred during that second. I've gone from 9 months to 1 second in a matter of moments. Another thing that we can accomplish with the performance of the NitroView Enterprise Security Manager is to quickly focus on anomalies to learn more relevant behavior. For example, in this case we see a particular IP address who's exhibiting more event behavior than expected by almost 200%. If we look further, we see that certain IP addresses show even greater degrees of anomalous behavior. And we can quickly drill down and summarize on a variety of information sources, including event, network, application, topology, and geolocation. In this case, we can quickly see that the applications involved with this particular IP address are all World Wide Web or HTTP. We can drill down further, look at the types of events that are associated with this. We see that there are a lot of TCP protocol anomalies, and let's say that we want to know now where the destination countries of this web traffic were. In this case, we see the majority in the United States and the United Kingdom. And again, we can also summarize to see all event information associated with this particular source IP. The events that occurred, the source and destination IPs, and when they occurred over time. And we can also expand this maintaining our focus on the particular source IP in question to see the entire year's worth of event information and when they occurred over time.
The final step in your security posture is your compliance, which requires security practice that's in line with various industry guidelines. Compliance requires auditable security within a specific context, but ultimately requires understanding of users, roles, data, privacy, assets, networks, enclaves, sometimes custom or proprietary needs of both the customer and the industry. Again, this requires an understanding within the SIM that can look deeper than just log data, network event detection, or network activity monitoring. The SIM must be able to understand users. It must understand identity. It must understand policy. It must be able to see deeper into the information and draw more context around that information so that the security events being managed can be put in line with the specific guidelines of the compliance mandate you're trying to comply with.